I want to show you a timing attack on passwords, and we'll go through it very carefully and rigorously. And then I'll talk about RSA as an implementer. Of course, I'm not going to talk about too much algebra, the minimal amount of algebra which is required to explain RSA. So let's begin now with a timing attack on passwords. And to assist me, I'm going to use a figure that actually J.F. Dem used in his 1988 paper, Practical Implementation of the Timing Attack. And this is, again, this corresponds to our discussion from last week about what does the attacker have, what does the victim have, what are the objectives of the attacker. So we see here a victim. This is the victim, protocol smart card, implementation, the device under test. And what does this device have? It has a secret inside. And what is the, so this is the asset of the victim. In the case of a password guessing attack, obviously the asset of the victim is going to be the password. So what is the objective of the attacker in our case? What does the attacker want to do? Yes, to probably get the password. So this is actually in a low level, I want the attacker to get the password. But in a high level, the attacker might want, for example, to open the door or to access the service or to read the file. It's very, very important to define the objectives of the attacker very carefully. Because if, let's say, the objectives of the attacker are just to open the door, which is protected by the password, there could be other ways of doing it which don't involve the timing attack at all. So when we're talking about the objectives of the attacker, you have to be very, very careful to impersonate somebody else. Could be a very good example, as Gili says. I might be able to impersonate somebody else even if I don't know this person's password, if I do some other thing. So very careful. You need to be very careful in defining. In our case, the objective is to discover the password. And now, what are the objectives of the attacker? What are the abilities of the attacker? So in our case, as discussed by J.F. Dem, the attacker can send unlimited queries to the implementation and measure their execution time. And yes, they can be adaptive. In our case, they can be adaptive. So there are two objectives, two abilities that the attacker has. First of all is sending unlimited queries, and the second is measuring their execution time. So let's try to think about cases where the attacker cannot send unlimited queries. So unlimited queries means I can send as many requests to the victim as I want. So can somebody suggest a case where I cannot send unlimited queries? So indeed, a PIN code or an ATM machine, indeed. What happens if I send too many queries to an ATM machine, or I try to unlock the phone? It gets shredded, or I get blocked, right? So there are devices which have unlock counters or maximum number of retries. Okay, so this is one case where I can't do unlimited queries. Is there another case, kind of a trickier case, where I can't do unlimited queries? Okay, Lido says something. If the key keeps changing, that's a good one. There is an encryption scheme called double wired equivalent privacy, WEP, which was a very old crypto system which was used to protect wireless before WPA2 came online. It wasn't very secure, but it did have a nice trick. And the key was changed every 2 to the power of 40 messages. It wasn't a particularly strong crypto system, but there was no way of getting more than 2 to the 40 packets encrypted under the same key, because they would just keep changing. So in the case of WEP, I would not be able to send unlimited queries. But I want to talk about something which was more implementation-wise thinking. Um, what if we have a device which beeps every time you send a query? Or what if you have a device and the guard is standing next to the device? Or what if you have a device in somebody's backpack and you're following this person and trying to attack this person? So they're outside events. So if I'm going, for example, to attack an e-voting machine, in theory, I can do whatever I want, but in practice, the committee sitting outside the ballot will hear the beeping and say, why is all this beeping going on? Let's try to figure out what's happening. Or if I'm following somebody for too long, this somebody will say, yeah, I don't like to be followed so much. Maybe you could stop or something. Okay, so unlimited query is an assumption which has to be justified. And the second assumption, measuring the execution time of each query. So again, we want to justify this. Can somebody give me a situation where I cannot measure the execution time? Okay. When can I say that it's not justified to say that the attacker can measure the execution time? When is it impossible for the attacker to measure the execution time? So indeed, if there's a fixed time implementation, which means every once every hour I can send a query, and once every other hour I get the response, then the the function, the execution time, is not a function of the code. But again, this is a kind of countermeasure. You have to obviously choose the maximum time, and you don't want that. Another thing is if you do a blind query, for example, I don't get a response at all. That's a good one, Gil. If I don't get a response, I can't measure the execution time. The third one, which is kind of very tricky to pin down, but sometimes there is no notion of time for the attacker and for the victim. Uh, the attacker and the victim don't have the same time. For example, you're running in an operating system where you send the question to the implementation, and then the operating system freezes you in place and lets the system run, and then the system returns. You get unfrozen, but you don't even know that some time has passed, and you have no way of measuring time. And there are various sandboxes which are built this way. JavaScript is not very good at doing it, but for example, I think web cloud workers, I think, are supposed to do it. The idea is that you don't know, you can't measure time which is passing when you're not running. So, but again, these are ways where it's unjustified. So now let's turn this around. So can you give me kind of use cases where it's very, very reasonable to assume that I can send unlimited queries and measure the execution time? So one very good use case where I can do this is, can anybody suggest? Let's go to the simplest case. The simplest possible case is, yeah, if I have the device as one instance in the lab, or if I have a device in my possession. Why would the attacker have the device under test in his possession? Where would I encounter this case? So one of them is in the lab. Where is in another case where this happens? So yeah, if I steal one, I already have it. But maybe okay. A smart card, as I was already saying, and I'll be more specific. A smart TV card, a pay TV card, or a SIM card inside the phone the SIM card inside the phone has all sorts of secrets, and the SIM card doesn't want the user to get all the secrets because you want the SIM card wants to control your access to the network and to all sorts of other valued added services on the network. So the SIM card is not going to give you the case of C, which is it's holding. But definitely you have a smart card in your hand. Another example is the pay TV. you have the pay TV in your house, and this card is not letting you watch whatever you want. But again, you can query it as long as you want. So if the device is in your hand, this is a good use case. What is another use case? Another use case, a good use case, is the VM use case. And let me justify this a little. Um, I am running on the same hardware with the victim, but the victim is shielded from me, protected from me for some reason. One very good use case for this is what is called the card data environment, CDE. The idea is that if you're trying to process credit card numbers in your application, you have to be very, very compliant to PCI, which is a data security standard, very difficult to comply with it. And what happens is that you can get vendors who will sell you virtual machines, which are PCI DSS certified, and you just run them. And if you protect them properly, then you can say all of my card data is inside the VM, and I can do all sorts of crazy PHP stuff outside because it's in the VM and I can't access it. But maybe I can try to send a lot of queries to this VM and measure the execution time. Another example, maybe have an operating system service which verifies signatures, and it won't let me know what is the verification key. Maybe I have a login prompt or something like that. So anytime I have a service on my own computer which is protected from me, that's another good use case. And the third use case is how else can the other access this device? I think I heard this here. What is the third and maybe most challenging as for an attacker? The web, indeed, as Vidal says, the web. If I can access the device over the net, then I can measure the execution time. Will I be able to get a good measurement of the execution time? Depends. Probably not. I won't be able to get a very good measurement, but I remind you that the noise that will be added to this measurement is not correlated with the signal. So maybe I'll just have to do a lot of measurements and average them. And there is academic work establishing how much measurements I need. And it's actually very, very possible to do timing measurements from one side of the internet to the other side. Okay, another thing I'm going to assume is that I have the source code of the implementation. Is this a reasonable assumption? Yes. Kerchhoff's principle says that I know everything except the secret. So I have the source code. Okay, so now that I have everything ready, I am going to show you an implementation of a timing attack on a password checker, and it's a password checker that I wrote myself. Please look at my wonderful JavaScript coding skills. So who here is seeing JavaScript for the first time on this slide? Okay. So I see there are many of you who haven't been exposed to JavaScript. It's a very simple language, basically. You see, it's not very yeah. Here are the results. Not very difficult language. It's just this. There is no this. Oh, okay. So this is a password checker that I wrote myself, and I'm going to explain it line by line, being assisted by the line numbers. So this is a secret password. It's hard-coded, but it doesn't have hard-coded. And this is the function it gets as input in password, and the type of in password is there are no types in JavaScript. Nana kanana. So the first thing I do is I'm going to check in line 4 that the length of the password input to me is the same as the length of the password I'm storing. Why am I doing this? What do I want to protect against? Yeah, so exactly. I want to protect myself from buffer overflows. So now, once I reach line 8, I'm certain that the input length and the secret length are the same. And now I'm going to compare them character by character. And if there's a mismatch, I will exit with false. If I get to line 14, it means that all of the characters in the password and the secret are the same, and that the lengths are the same, and then I can return true, and everything is fine. So now let's have a 10-minute break. And when I return from the break, we are going to attack this implementation. So you have the stage, and